Good evening, everybody. May Allah accept our fasting and prayers in this holy month of Ramadan and recover all the world from this pandemic of COVID-19. At this time, I'm pleased to host Dr. Feroz Mohammed, the Professor of Radiology and Neurophysics and the Director of Jefferson Integrated MR Center at Thomas Jefferson University in the United States. Feroz conducts an annual fMRI workshop in the SFNR, American Society of Functional Neurology, and he's one of the leaders there. Also, Feroz has many publications and books, and one of the books that I really like and recommend to my fellows is Functional Neurology book by Feroz. Tonight, Feroz will speak about fundamentals of fold and diffusion of MRI, and I hope all of you will enjoy it and find it of high interest to you. Just to remind you that this initiative is for the period of COVID-19 for education only. We will start, so please mute yourself as I will do. And the questions will be in the chat. Dr. Feroz Mohammed will take it at the end or whenever he thinks it's appropriate. Welcome, Feroz. It's an honor to have you. Please go ahead and share your screen. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And can you hear me now, or?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, and assalamu alaikum to everybody. And I wanted to wish you all Ramadan Kareem. Whoever is celebrating Ramadan, I wanted to thank Maki, my friend and colleague for a very long time, for inviting me to do this. It's been really an honor knowing Maki for a long time and also to do this talk. Maki. So Maki, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm going to share my screen and start the discussion. And as Maki said, if anybody is interested in asking me questions, you can chat with me and we can discuss about that towards the end of the lecture. So here we are. Okay. Okay. Are you able to see my screen? I suppose. Good. Okay. I wanted to talk about two things. One, of course, is blood oxygenation level dependent imaging, or we all call it as fMRI, and also about diffusion imaging. And so I organized it one after the other. But before we start the bold imaging, I also wanted to give a little brief history about how bold imaging came about and more how it is being performed clinically, and more importantly, what are the limitations of that. So historically, it all started with in the early 1930s with the invention of or discovery, I should say, of the magnetic properties of oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin, as we all know, is diamagnetic. It has very similar susceptibility to that of the pure water or cellular tissue. What I mean by that is if you take oxyhemoglobin particles and put it inside a magnetic field, it's not going to disturb any other protons in the neighboring, it doesn't affect the neighboring protons. However, deoxyhemoglobin is paramagnetic. What that means by that is if you take a molecule of deoxyhemoglobin and put it inside a magnetic field, it disturbs the magnetic field of the surrounding or the neighboring protons. and hence it experiences slightly large magnetic field with respect to the surrounding plasma. So this was an important discovery that happened in the 1940s by Linus Pauling, one of an American chemist. But it was not until the 1980s this discovery was translated into clinics per se, when NMR was being thought about as being useful for potentially imaging the human body. And it was done by Keith Thalburn, who is actually still works in the fMRI Center at the University of Chicago. He's a biophysicist by training. So what he thought was, okay, maybe the concentration of oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin might have different relaxation properties, and which potentially we could measure using NMR. So he created samples of different concentration and then stick it inside an NMR or an MRI. And here is the graph that shows the T1 rates and the T2 rates. For those of you who are not familiar with the rates, the relaxation rates are 1 over the T1 values and 1 over the T2 values. And what it turns out is, as you increase the oxygenated hemoglobin percentage inside these different test tubes, you can see that there is your T2 relaxation goes down, your signal intensity goes up, and the T2 relaxation constant goes down. Very, very interesting phenomena. So he translated that into imaging. And here is a couple of images. On the left-hand side is a spin echo image with the test tube inside, placed in doped water. And the top row is doped with the test tube inside is filled with oxygenated hemoglobin. And the first row is spin echo, as I said. The second row is a gradient echo, T2 star imaging. If you look at the oxygenated hemoglobin, it's very uniform. There is no disturbance of these protons because it is, as I mentioned before, it is diamagnetic. However, if you look at the bottom row, the test tube, the deoxyhemoglobin actually leaks into outside, which basically is a drop in signal intensity. And because of the susceptibility weighting caused by gradient echo imaging, the distortion is more exaggerated than what you see in spin echo images, right? So this was sort of the first imaging experiment to show that deoxyhemoglobin in the presence of a magnetic field causes signal loss compared to oxygenated hemoglobin. And then it was not until the 1990s when Seiji Ogawa, who is now considered as the father of fMRI, was doing some experiments with rat brains on hypoxia and anoxia. And you can see here on the left side, a rat brain. And you see this is normoxic, and it's pretty nice and uniform, like everybody would see it. But however, during hypoxia, he started seeing these striations, which were very paradoxical at that time initially when he first observed it. But then he repeated his experiments. And then, of course, with the dissection and stuff, he found that this is probably, these are all coming from from the blood vessels or venules and arterioles and stuff like that. So he came up with a theory that this decrease in signal intensity potentially might be because of the presence of the deoxyhemoglobin, which we know is more paramagnetic, and coined the term BOLD, blood oxygenation level dependency imaging, that this could be potentially because of the blood oxygenation that you're able to see these contrast, as we all know in radiology, how contrast is so important. But the important thing is it's a negative contrast, right? BOLD imaging creates a negative contrast in this case. So this was the first initial flowchart that he put together in terms of what this potentially means if there is increased brain activity, right? So if I ask you any one of you to move your right hand, we all know the left motor cortex gets active. There is increased requirement of increased cerebral blood flow. RCBV is increasing, RCBF is increasing because of the need for CMRR2. You need energy for the left motor cortex to do the task initially, right? So the jury is still out there in terms of the relationship between CMRR2 and brain activity. However, the CMR glucose has been pretty well established to show increased consumption when there is increased brain activity. So if you take your camera, meaning your MR scanner, and look at the left motor cortex during these two different states, you would find that during increased brain activity, there is an increase of oxyhemoglobin, and then there is a decrease, a much decrease of deoxyhemoglobin, right? So we know deoxyhemoglobin is more paramagnetic. If it is very less, the susceptibility would go down, and you can see an increase in signal in the T2 star weighted images, right? So the long story short, if there is increased brain activity, and if you do a T2 star imaging, in which case the familiar term is gradient echo imaging, you will see an increased brain signal intensity. So it's an indirect measure, and it's a very long relationship between increased brain activity and increased MR signal intensity. So here is a cartoon that shows that initially when it was discovered, you need to have a relative measure. So on the left side is your rest condition, meaning I'm not asking you not to move your right hand. You would see normative blood flow, equal number of oxyhemoglobin, which are in red, and deoxyhemoglobin, which are in white. However, when I ask you to move your hand, there is demand of blood flow, CMR2, CMRO2, CMR glucose increase. There is increased blood flow because of the decreased deoxyhemoglobin. So decreased deoxyhemoglobin, if you do a GRE image, your T2 star image shows brighter, right? So this was also shown graphically that between the two states of rest and change between in terms of signal intensity at a certain echo time. And this is what we called it as the bold effect. And the bold effect is something that we use to map out the brain functions. So here are some very key references. The one that I talk about the discovery in the 1930s about the oxyhemoglobin and Ogawa, and then it took off in the early 90s. Ken Kwong did the first experiment in humans in vivo to show this phenomena. And here is the first experiment that was shown, where a simple experiment, motor cortex, as you all know, the red spots are the highlighted activation maps in the motor cortex, sagittal view. But if you look at the bottom chart shows you the boxcar-like pattern of activation and deactivation. During the off condition, the subject was asked not to move the hand when there is low signal intensity, and then the signal intensity increases, it decreases, increases, decreases. So you can take this information and do some statistics to finally map out and find the region where the actual activation is. I just wanted to highlight one simple important point here. If you look at the graph here, the graph starts not from 0, but at 100. And people at that time were wondering what this is all about. Now we know that the brain doesn't rest. Brain is active all the time, right? So, and people started looking at this, why this signal always present, and found out that there is small low frequency fluctuations in the brain, which can also be measured, and which started this whole new field of resting state fMRI. Right. We'll talk about it a bit in the field later. So how do we capture the bold signal? There are two simple designs. One is what we call as a block design. So you present blocks of similar trials or events together. You have the rest state. Again, going back to my example of moving your right hand for looking at left motor cortex activation. And then during the task state, you ask the subject to move his or her hand. And then the idea would be to look at mean activation levels of neuronal activity during these blocks, right? So it's called block because it goes as in blocks, or what you otherwise call as boxcar experiments. There are some advantages of doing this. It's very simple and easy to analyze, simple to implement. Anybody can do it on their scanner if they have a coplanar sequence, a T2 star sequence inside, present in their repository of sequences. The detection power is very good if you can do over and over again. However, there are some issues. Our brain doesn't think in blocks. So there is predictability, there is habituation. If you ask somebody to move their hand over a few minutes, your brain suddenly gets bored and say, hey, you know what, I know what you're doing. So there is no requirement for increased amount of glucose or metabolism involved. So it's not quite really good for anything other than motor mapping, or maybe in some instances for language mapping. So there is habituation and predictability here. So psychologists came up with a new design, what we called as event-related design, where where different events are given at different time points. And then you can group them to allow for modeling of the associated signals with isolated events. One good thing about this is it removes the predictability. So one doesn't have to think about, how the trial is going, and people don't have to assume that similar trials are going to come, and so on and so forth. It's a little more challenging to implement, but although now we have methods so that some of these technical challenges have been avoided. So here is a very simple experiment. Somebody inside the scanner, and as you can see, this is the T2 star weighted EPI images. And the experiment was to map the visual cortex. The rectangular red box represents the visual cortex. I don't think anybody can see visually the change in the signal. It all looks very blurry. A radiologist may not even like this image because it's not the best anatomical image. However, if you look at this little more closely, meaning if you look at what happened between these different events, right? So maybe the first two images were obtained when during the rest condition, and the second two might be during the task condition. In this case, task, if we want to activate the visual cortex, we can shine a flashing light inside the scanner so the patient can see it. Today we have more sophisticated ways to do it, and then switch it off, switch it on, switch it off, switch it on. And while this paradigm is going through, you collect a signal over a period of time, and then take these images and, of course, bin them into two baskets, right? Images of all the images captured during the rest condition, you can put into one basket. All the images that you collected during the activation, you can put it into one basket. And then all you have to do is a simple subtraction, right? You put them, align them, and you put a simple subtraction. You'll start seeing numbers. Wherever there are less differences, you will see zeros and ones. But however, if you look and go down at the visual cortex, you'll start seeing large differences. And these differences can be, of course, we need to make sure they are statistically significant. You can apply your most favorite statistical test between these two groups and come up with maps like this, colorful maps, where if the differences are very minimal, they're all colored red. If the differences are larger, you start seeing variations of yellow, and this is supposed to be most significant. Now we can go do your thresholding, where you can eliminate all the uniform and very less statistically significant maps. And now what you're left with is the signals that is coming exclusively from your visual cortex. Of course, as radiologists, we don't like this image. The T2 star weighted image is good for bold, but not good for anatomic. So you can actually put that image overlay onto an anatomic image. Now we know exactly where the activation potentially has come from, right? And this is what we are all come to love and familiarize with as the bold image or fMRI image, right? So, however, the subtraction is not very simple, unfortunately, because we are doing voxel by voxel comparisons. And so, and there could be movement of the patient inside the scanner, because the scan takes place over a period of several minutes. For example, if you're doing motor cortex mapping, it takes almost 2 minutes to collect the whole data, and we're collecting EPI scans very quickly. So one needs to do something called motion correction, right? You want to correct the motion correction, you want to correct for motion between the patient, between the different scans. And there are various steps: one, motion correction, smoothing, normalization, and so on. This something called as a pre-processing steps. These are steps that one has to do before we finally come up with bold maps, right? So today you can get softwares that can allow you to do this in a more reasonable manner. But of course, there are also softwares which have more rigorous in different methods, implementing different methods for analysis as well. So once you do the pre-processing, the next step is something called as the statistics, because we are all, we have all come to know that, statistics is very important, making sure that these signals are properly vetted. So the most popular statistics, how we would do that. I want to talk a little bit about motion correction. Motion correction is one of the biggest problems in fMRI, and head movement occurs during EPI scans. Small movements can cause false positive activations that are not supposed to be there. There could be what effect it has on an image if there is movement on the edges and inside the brain. A 0.5 shift in pixel shift changes can show up to 3 to 5% change in the signal intensity. Similarly, inside a 0.25. So it's very important that we do the motion correction. There are many ways of doing it. The idea is something that has moved because the patient coughed or patient sneezed or whatever, you're bringing them back into alignment. So that's essentially the things. There are various ways of doing it. Some are better than the other, but one, I think, should definitely do the correction. Here are some examples. For example, on the top is what we call translation. So if you need to look at movement happens in 3-dimensional way. Patients can move up and down, right to left, or rotate their head. So one need to correct for all of that. So if you look at here, the top chart looks at translation in the X, Y, and Z plane, the various images collected during the acquisition. And you can see that it's all pretty much okay at some point. This patient might have coughed, and suddenly there's a Z translation. And we need to be cognizant about like how much this patient has moved. And you can also see the patient has rotated his or her head, right? So it's important to do this correction within certain boundary conditions to make sure that they don't move too much and it doesn't affect the bold signal and give us false positive. You can on the scanner today get these online monitoring methods where you can actually, this is from a Siemens scanner, you can actually look for translation and motion while we actually collecting the data. Something important that you should, anybody in practice should do before we send it out for data processing. If there is too much motion, it's better to repeat the scan because your data might be invalid and probably meaningless after you go through all the analysis pipeline. So once you do the pre-processing, as I mentioned, you got to do something called the general linear model statistics. It's a very fancy term for doing regression, right? You're probably all familiar with regression. If you have two different sets of data and see how good they are, how correlated they are, is what we call regression. Here, general linear model does complex regression because we are doing regression of individual voxels throughout the brain, depending upon the number of voxels. Here, it's very simple. It's a y equals xb plus e, and y is your observed data. For example, when you ask a patient to do your hand movement and we're collecting the bold signal, y is the observed data that is coming from the scanner. X is your design matrix, meaning this is the expected data, right? So what we are looking for is how far your observed data is different from your expected data, right? And that difference is what we will use to create something called as the beta parameter, which gives you the bold signal, right? And of course, there is also an error component. So we try to minimize the error by using your fancy general linear model technique called analysis of variance and try to estimate the beta parameter. So once you get the beta parameter, then you can map it out into onto parts of the brain. And then here you see what we call as a glass brain or maximum intensity projection brain, where you see activations coming from showing in dark colors, black colors from different parts. This is again a motor cortex, and then you can overlay them onto an anatomic map where you can see supplementary motor areas and primary motor cortex areas coming with this experiment. Here is an example from the clinics where there's a brain tumor, and again looking for motor cortex. So you can see a nice SMA, motor SMA, and of course this was a unilateral experiment. People come up with different various experiments, and we're looking for one side on the side of the tumor, and you can present this in many ways. So, how is this useful? Many of you are practitioners of this. Hope not to bore you all. There are many applications people are utilizing this for, mostly for motor cortex mapping, hand, foot, tongue, etc. And then, of course, the most important application, as I'm seeing as the field is growing, is for language mapping, primarily for looking at language comprehension and language expression. There are various tasks people use. Object naming is one of them, where people present, show on the screen objects, and then people look at these objects and people name them. And while doing that, their comprehension area and the expression area gets activated. Verb generation is another one, sentence completion and word generation, and the list goes on and on. But I'll talk about the consensus at the moment from the ASFNR white paper about what are the techniques, the tasks that are most widely used. And why do we need that? Because the bold mapping is necessary, or it's useful, I should say, for mapping the eloquent cortex. And of course, DTI is used for mapping the white matter tracks. It provides guidance for biopsy for the eloquent cortex and white matter. Majority of them has been clinically validated. They've been compared to intracortical mapping, and subcortical stimulation mapping has also been accomplished in many studies, and more people are more comfortable in its application. And as the technology is also evolving, these techniques and images are now available inside the OR. And a working relationship with a neuroradiologist and a physicist / a neurosurgeon really goes well in terms of accomplishing this in the right way. So here is a workflow as a radiologist. How does this work? So on the left is when you get an order from a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, then you should be ready with your paradigm library. Okay, here is a patient. What library should I be using? What paradigm should I be using? Right. A very important thing is the task training and ability. Right. You need to have the patient understand what you're going to do, make sure that they're able to respond what you're going to ask them, especially when we're talking about language mapping, because if they're not going to be interactive and performing, then your results are not going to be results are going to be meaningless. So once you have the task training, and then you put the subjects inside the scanner, the various checks and measures one needs to do, and then now these days you can get get stimulus presentation devices, monitoring devices, and so on, which are commercially available. And then, of course, once the data is collected, the data is sent to a post-processing workstation where where all the motion correction and statistics and color overlay and presentation happens. Again, there are a few vendors that actually provide the softwares for clinical utility and also connectivity to the neurosurgery surgical suites so that images can be seamlessly transferred. And then, of course, it needs to be stored into the interpretation, and it's also very important, and into packs so that for distribution. So here is a paradigm, a motor map paradigm. Here is a task. This is the activation, rest condition, activation condition. You've all done this many times, many of you probably, and it provides maps like this, the motor cortex map. This is a presentation in the sagittal format, and this is a presentation in the axial format, and some people like to look at it in a three-dimensional way as well. And this is a very robust task. Hand movement is a very robust task. The example that I showed you is using one hand, and many of ASFNR is recommending to do bilateral hand movement, where you can do both at the same time, unless you have some specific reason not to do so. I'm going to give you an example of a sentence completion task where the rest condition is a gibberish sentence, nonsensical. You should specifically ask patients not to make any sense out of it, because sometimes they may, try to do things and and try to make sense out of the sentences. And then followed by, sentences that make sense, and they're supposed to read the sentence, for example, before going to bed. You should brush, and when it's hot out, I like to eat ice cream or whatever. So I'm sorry, Maki, we talked about eating. So, but anyway, so so it's one of those tasks that I think the patients would love to actually do it. And quite frankly, this is one of the tasks that is very, very effective, and across the globe. There is uniformity in terms of the performance of the sentence completion task in whatever language that you do, in producing Broca and Wernicke activation. Typically, this task is done. Typically in a clinic, what people do is they are not just doing one particular task; they're doing multiple tasks, and they take multiple tasks. And in our center, what we do is we do something called as common voxel analysis, where here the color, you see multiple colors, but the red color is the area which is common to, let's say, in this particular case, 3 tasks: sentence completion, verb generation, and word generation tasks. And we do a common voxel analysis to look for commonalities in these tasks and significance. This would give confidence to the neurosurgeons as well as neuroradiologists in terms of the results, right? So there are various methods of doing analysis. Okay, this is all great, but there are lots of limitations of fMRI, which I think as practitioners, we should know. One of the biggest limitation is fMRI is an indirect response of neuronal activity. You're not directly measuring it like EEG or single, or sticking an electrode and measuring the neuronal activity. It comes from a convoluted effects of neuronal activities, and what we call as the hemodynamic response essentially is what we're measuring. And as you probably know, the hemodynamic response takes almost a couple of seconds to even start, and it increases and peaks at 5 seconds, and it goes down at 12 seconds, right? So the HRF, or hemodynamic response function is commonly called, is very sluggish. It's very slow, right? So temporal resolution is a very bad thing, poor thing. So bold is limited by temporal resolution, right? So, however, you have limitations as well in terms of how fast you can scan. Going really fast scan introduces thermal noise, which introduces noise in the image. Of course, there is also this T1 effect, which also causes spin relaxation issues, though. However, we have new techniques now. Some of you are probably familiar with. It's called simultaneous multi-slice or multi-band imaging. where you could actually reduce the TR and do sub-second imaging. So that's something new that has come around, where so you can increase the temporal resolution more, so you can collect more data. It may not be that it may not be that important in doing block design, collecting motor and sensory tasks and language tasks, but it's really important if you're doing resting state to do sub-second measurements. And of course, the other issue is head motion. I talked about pulsatile motion and motion correlated changes in the variation in spin history. All of these can be corrected, but these are some of the challenges that one should be paying attention to if you want to get proper results. Spatial resolution is an issue. There is a limitation on what the voxel size is. But with increased gradient strengths now, with 80 millitesla scanner that is now available, one can potentially come with some of those issues as well, and you can go as small a thickness as possible. And then the actual improvement in the bold signal itself, as we know that the bold signal increases with the increase in field strength, right? So if you have a 3 Tesla scanner, which is almost like 15 to 20% more signal than if you have a 1.5 Tesla scanner. Well, that's not sufficiently enough for some physicists and clinicians. So they've gone to develop now 7 Tesla. 7 Tesla is, at least in the US, is FDA approved. And there are probably like 40, 50, 7 Teslas around the globe. And there are a couple of 11 Teslas installed as well. So the field is still wide open, and people are still developing these scanners so that we can increase the bold signal. If you remember from my previous slide where I showed you the signal difference, that signal difference between the rest and activation is something like 5% from visual cortex on a 1.5 Tesla scanner. On a 7 Tesla, that difference is something like 30%. So you're really, really confident that you're able to do it. Optimization methods are still working. People are working at it, especially now with the advent of simultaneous multi-slice imaging or or multiband imaging. One thing as practitioners, it's important to know the QA. There are various QAs. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but a few of them maybe. Hardware is an issue. Hardware, this is not like regular MR scanning. You need to sort of monitor your temporal behavior of your scanner. Patient compliance is the most important thing. If the patient is not complying, then you're not getting good data, and of course, post-processing. Here is one issue with the hardware. What you see here is the different views of the brain, and what we call is the TSNR. For most of you are familiar with regular SNR. Here is the temporal SNR. So collecting signal over a period of time, you are able to get the temporal SNR, right? So if you look at the orange spots and the blue spots is where you have a very, very low TSNR. Not surprisingly, as you all know, this is where the closer to the temporal bones, this is where the high susceptibility is. So your scanner needs to be shimmed properly and trained, and done, corrected properly if you want to engage in experiments, for example, like epilepsy, language mapping, and things like that. As I mentioned, patient compliance is important. People do various things. There is pre-scan preparations about whether they're able to see things, do things, and so on. There is also behavioral screening. Are they able to understand the task? So you need to have a repertoire of multiple tasks, multiple speeds. For example, somebody is unable to do sentence completion as fast as somebody else. So you should have different various speeds as well in terms of the task. So a very important thing to remember. And recently, BOLD is used for other things. One is for functional connectivity, which is resting state. Another one is effective connectivity. Functional connectivity is defined as correlations between different geographical regions, but there is temporal correlations between the psychological events. This has been really important to develop this new field called the resting state fMRI, where what is happening is inside the brain there are low frequency fluctuation in the bold signal. They're so low it can be captured, and subjects do not have to do any tasks. And these low frequency fluctuations, even though they are geographically different, are correlated, right? That's what makes it very interesting. So there are methods that you can use to, extract this low frequency fluctuations. And here you go. This is the first experiment that was done. On the left side is a on the left side is a task-based fMRI where there is, you can see the familiar motor cortex on either side, and of course C is the supplementary motor area. But when you start looking at no tasks, when you ask the subject to do no tasks, and when you're looking at the the low frequency fluctuations and trying to extract them and do correlation analysis, you will see these green signals here overlapping within the bold signal. Of course, this was a very first experiment, very weak, but now people have been beginning to use this for clinical fMRI. So here is patient 1 and patient 2, a motor task, task-based, and look at task-free. Without doing any task, the patient, you can see motor activation. And here is an overlap, right? Very important. And here is an example on language tasks as well, showing these are all basically using resting state fMRI, right? So there are challenges to it. People are still developing methods for it. But one big advantage is a non-compliant patient, right? A patient who is unable to, unfortunately, speak or unfortunately do a task potentially should be tried with resting state if you want to map out their functions. I'm going to skip the effective connectivity. So in summary, bold-based fMRI has been shown to be effective in mapping various brain functions, right? As I mentioned, so various analysis methods are being developed. The general linear model analysis method is the most popular statistical method, but there are groups that are using cross-correlation methods as well. Various clinical paradigms are being tested, and I would highly recommend you to go to the ASFNR website. I will give you the website towards the end of the lecture, where there are all these tried and tested paradigms that are available, and it's available for download. If you want to practice this, if you want to take it, you can download it and you can use it. And there are various groups studying the reproducibility of the bold data, and it's still a work in progress. And the functional connectivity methods are being studied and developed, and of course, resting state is being studied extensively, right? So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the other topic, which is the white matter mapping, which is based on diffusion, right? All this while we're talking about cortical mapping based on bold imaging, and then we talk about white matter mapping. And diffusion has been around for a while, and you can use MR to measure the diffusion of the water molecule, especially whether this is anisotropic or anisotropic, which gives you the directionality, right? And here you see what is isotropic movement, right? So if you have a water molecule that moves equidistant in all directions, what we call as isotropic movement, right? And here is a spherical structure. This is isotropic movement. And typically water molecules move in this way. However, there are certain biological structures inside a body, specifically in this case, myelinated fibers or protein fibers, where this is not isotropic because there is restriction of because of the myelin barriers. Now they're not moving isotropic, they're moving not equidistant in all the different directions. They're stretched in different directions, what we call as anisotropic movement, right? So in diffusion, we can actually measure whether the movement is anisotropic or isotropic, and hopefully this will potentially tell something about the white matter structures because it's very highly anisotropic. How is diffusion done? I'll try to explain this in a simplistic cartoon here. Imagine these little thingies in these square boxes are all protons, right? So the first, and then you have multiple boxes. On top, you have two triangular things. Those are gradients, MR gradients, as you all know. And at the bottom, you see a bar, a color bar with this bright signal, dark signal, and light signal, right? So let's start from here. So when all the protons are inside the magnetic field, they're all aligned, they're all in phase, you get a bright signal, right? However, when you apply a gradient, they go out of phase. When you go out of phase, as you all know, the signal goes down. It's dark. However, then after, let's say after sometimes the gradient is applied, if there is no movement, if there is a stationary tissue, the phase is retained and the signal is low. However, if you apply a reverse gradient, it's brought back in phase and the signal is brought back, right? So without diffusion, that's what I'm meaning by no movement. However, just keep an eye on this particular slide, the third rectangular box. If there is any movement, right? If there is any movement, then your signal is going to be not pure white, but it's shades of gray, because your signal before here, they're gone out of phase. Your gradient is unable to bring them full phase. It's a new phase that it is gaining, right? So it is this out of phase shades of gray signal that you're obtaining using in this case spin echo, right? You're all familiar with this pulse sequence, the spin echo sequence, 90, 180, you collect your signal. This is a little more complicated because this is an echoplanar signal where you're rapidly refacing phase and gradient. However, in the second line, the G slice, you see a bipolar gradient. This is what we call as a diffusion gradient. Gradient that I talked in the previous, so you in previous figure. So you apply the gradient and make sure you sensitize your protons, and you refocus it back using the second gradient, and the time difference between this is measured, the amplitude is measured. All of that is encompassed in this what we call as a B factor. When we do diffusion, we get called B factor. So the B value is basically the gradient strength, and the A is the signal that you're measuring. By using this simple equation, you can actually calculate the diffusion. And typically it's in two directions. However, diffusion is a three-dimensional process. Your water molecule is moving all over the place. So you can use a certain type of matrix called a simple 3x3 matrix, where you can collect not just direction in one particular place, but you can do 6 different directions, and you are able to, so meaning you're able to manipulate your gradients and turn it off and turn it on in 6 different directions: XX, XY, XZ, YZ, and ZZ. And then you're able to calculate what we call as the different parameters like lambda 1s and lambda 2. Basically what it is a tensor is a complex vector. As we know, a vector is direction. Here, tensor, you're able to measure the vector movement in 3 dimensions, right? Once you have that, you can use those formulas to actually calculate a few things. And if you remember from our previous discussion, the few slides, isotropy, right? How what is whether the molecule is anisotropic or isotropic, right? So it's called fractional anisotropy that you can calculate. This tells you the directionality of the water molecule. One can also calculate the diffusivity, how fast it is diffusing. One can measure the diffusivity, right? And all of this you can accomplish by actually collecting just 6 diffusion weighted images, and one meaning with a certain B value, and one image with a B value of 0, right? So use a spin echo sequence, echoplanar with 6 diffusion directions, and then you're able to calculate these things. And what does this tell you? When you calculate these measurements, you're able to represent the white matter fractional anisotropy, for example. That's what is represented in these colors below here. So on the left is something called as the directionally encoded color map. All it is showing is white matter bundles. The red color is the corpus callosum moving left to right, right? And the other one, you can see the corticospinal tract, which is in blue, and then green, which is going from tracks between left, right, and between right and, top to bottom. Now, you can extract, for example, the corpus callosum tracts and show it in a singular bundle in the corpus callosum tracts. And what is, however, this figure is not just a cool figure, but what is embedded in here is the fractional anisotropy values. What does that mean? Fractional anisotropy values vary between 0 and 1, 1 being very anisotropic, 0 being isotropic. So we know myelin bundles are highly anisotropic. If there is any breakage in the myelin sheet, it tends to more being isotropic, right? So it's a way of quantitating, looking at demyelination, for example. You can make some really nice pictures. This is a tractography of my brain, looking at, we still have all the white matters intact, I think. And then you can do all these corticospinal tract mapping and all of that stuff. But there are limitations, as like in any technique. There is susceptibility artifacts, which you're all familiar with, and tractography information that you can extract from the diffusion image is dependent on the user. The seed point designation as to like what tract that you want to extract is important. There was an issue before with the crossing fiber issues because the fibers are not going all parallel. There are fibers that are kissing and crossing. And now there are techniques which are beyond tensors called neurite density, Hardy, and DSI. I'm not going to talk about them here, but those techniques can resolve these crossing fibers, but they were not clinically feasible because the scan takes something like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. However, with this new technology called simultaneous multi-slices or multiband, you're able to collect these data much faster. So I would advocate using those techniques in your clinics so that you can have better resolution with tractography and better confidence in your tractograms, right? This particular slide, this shows the problems or pitfalls with tractography. For example, there's a cue ball imaging, which is the high angular tractography based on high angular. You can see there are a lot more tracts here, right? But if you look at your conventional fact-based DTI, it truncates, right? So it is very, very prudent and important to sort of use the right technique. So what is the impact of these fMRI and DTI in clinical work? There have been many studies that have looked so far on this and the impact of it on surgical planning. And this is what I think is the most three important highlights of that. One is it's reducing surgical time, which I think is very, very important for the neurosurgeon. And then, of course, is the intraoperative seizures. If they're claiming it's going to be reducing, and of course, you don't need to do additional tests like WADA, for example, in terms of language. So there is clear benefit in our clinics. We do almost 3 to 4 fMRIs and DTIs every week for pre-surgical assessment, and it is increasing even further. There is also advantages of using bold and diffusion in mapping compared to ICSM, which is the traditional gold standard intracortical mapping, as you all know. There is full brain coverage in imaging, where you can see a lot more activation regions. It's not limited by anesthesia, not limited by tasks. You can do all kinds of cognitive tasks. For example, in the future, there's going to be memory task, which is already being developed right now, but it's going to come into the clinics, and it's got better spatial resolution, so you're able to see smaller structures. So I will leave you with a figure here. This is something just came out last week from one of our studies at Jefferson, and using a traditional software from commercially available software, combining DTI and fMRI. So on the language mapping, I think the patient had seizures and enhancing mass and non-enhancing lesions components along the superior aspect of the I think it's a left middle temporal gyrus. The patient was left hemispheric language dominant, and the putative sensory speech and Wernicke's areas are seen in concordant activation, all the language tasks. Actually, this is a combination. Like as I mentioned, we do combined activation tasks, and motor speech and Broca's area activation in the left inferior frontal gyrus is sort of widely separated. from the mass. I'm sorry, my cursor is not moving. It's yeah. And if you're looking at on the bottom image, there is the DTI image. You can see the arcuate fasciculus, optic radiation. So the optic radiation along the inferior longitudinal fasciculus are expected to be close to the medial and inferior medial margins of the ring enhancing component of the lesion. That's what. So this is very useful. So this is what we use very clinically. We do combine DTI and language mapping, which probably a lot of you are all doing in your clinics, and that's one of the. And I leave you with this case to ponder about and how it can be used clinically. So what's the future? There are newer methods being developed against statistical methods. I think advanced diffusion methods, especially with simultaneous multi-slice, like higher angular diffusion imaging, is going to replace the regular DTI methods. New paradigms will come into existence to study memory and other tasks. Standard bold imaging will be augmented with task-based resting state fMRI methods. And so these are some things I think I foresee in the future that is happening. And I want to leave you with this, some of these important websites. For example, the asfnr.org website has lots of information for people. For example, if they want to do find out about what the right paradigm to use, different language paradigms that are available. You can actually download them, put it in a PowerPoint, and actually use it for your own utility. And they also talk about what ASFNR came up with a white paper on what the best language mapping paradigm to use, and sentence completion was on the top of the list. There is also dictation guidelines for both bold as well as DTI, how to dictate from a radiologist perspective. And then there is another organization called KIBA, which is an organized works with RSNA, Quantitative Imaging Biomarker Alliance, which is constantly looking to update reproducibility and utility of these techniques. So I will stop here and take any questions folks have. And once again, I thank you so much for Maki for organizing this, and thank you everybody for listening, especially in that part of the world, and I think wherever you are. So let me do the stop sharing, and then I can see if.
Thank you very much, Feroz. That was great. I don't see many questions there, but
okay.
Anyway, thank you very much. That was a great fundamental and reviews on bold and DTI, and looking forward for. Thank you.
So, Maki, there is one question I see here. Is it possible to distinguish between types of fiber tracts in patients with cerebral malformations? Yeah, Maki.
Do you hear me now? On DTI, we use it for the main tracts, but for small tracts, I don't have enough experience on that.
Yeah, so there is a software based out of Johns Hopkins, which where they have segmented and extracted various different types of tracts. You may want to take a look at that. And a lot of researchers are using it, and I have a feeling that you may have a lot of tracts that you can potentially use it based on those templates. It's a Johns Hopkins brain atlas. I'm sorry, DTI atlas.
Okay. Thank you very much, and looking forward for the next.
Yes. Thank you so much, Maki, and thank you, Mustafa and Mohammed, helping me set it up as well. And have a wonderful afternoon. Assalamu alaikum.